At 6:30 on the evening of my 72nd birthday, my son parked in front of a nursing home and told me to get out. He had promised me dinner, my favorite steakhouse, a birthday cake. Maybe even one quiet hour where he looked at me like his father instead of a problem. Instead, I was staring through the windshield at a glowing sign, Silver Pines Senior Living. Then the trunk popped open. My daughter-in-law Natalie stepped out, pulled 2 dark blue suitcases onto the curb, and smiled like she had completed an errand. They were my suitcases, my clothes, my medication, and somewhere inside, packed like a meaningless decoration, was the silver-framed photograph of my late wife, Eleanor. Eric would not look at me. "This is better for everyone, Dad," he said. Then I saw the thick manila folder tucked under Natalie's arm. Across the cover, in bold black letters, was my name. * Walter Bennett, long-term residential placement. * and taped to the corner was a red birthday ribbon. I did not shout. I did not refuse to get out. I simply asked one question. "Who signed me in?" Natalie smiled. "We handled all the paperwork." "Walter," she said, "you don't need to worry about that anymore. There was only one way they could have handled all the paperwork without me. They had either lied about my consent or forged authority over my life." That was when I understood. They had not brought me here for care. They had brought me here to disappear. But Eric had made one mistake. He had chosen Silver Pines. And what my son did not know was that I built Silver Pines 15 years earlier. He had just walked me into the one building in the state where abandoning an old man violated rules I wrote myself. Before this birthday dinner was over, he was going to learn the first rule of my company. We do not warehouse parents for the convenience of their children. The irony of standing in the driveway of a nursing home holding a photograph of my dead wife was not lost on me. Eleanor was the entire reason this place existed. 20 years ago, before I had any money or any real influence, my own mother, Agnes, had fallen ill. She had suffered a series of mild strokes that left her physically frail, though her mind remained as sharp as a diamond. At the time, I was working 60-hour weeks managing a regional construction firm, and Eleanor was teaching 3rd grade. We couldn't provide the round-the-clock physical assistance my mother needed, so we made the agonizing decision to move her into a local nursing home called Oak Creek Manor. The brochures for Oak Creek had been beautiful. The reality was a nightmare. Oak Creek didn't provide care. It provided storage. It was a place where the elderly were essentially warehoused, kept alive but completely stripped of their humanity. The staff were overworked and underpaid. The food was tasteless mush. But the worst part, the part that broke my heart every time I visited, was the anonymity of it all. No one called my mother Agnes. They called her Sweetie, or Honey, or, worse, the bed in room 214. They didn't know she had been a concert pianist. They didn't know she loved Earl Grey tea. They didn't know her, and they didn't care to. She lasted 8 months in that facility before she died, and when she passed, the administration didn't express condolences. They simply asked how quickly we could clear out her room for the next admission. I had stood in that sterile, beige hallway holding my mother's belongings in a cardboard box, vibrating with a rage so profound it physically hurt. Eleanor had placed her hand on my shoulder. She hadn't offered empty platitudes. My wife was too fiercely practical for that. "If you hate how they treated her," Walter, Eleanor had said, her voice steady and resolute, "then build the place she deserved." So I did. I quit my job. I took every dime of equity out of our house, secured a massive commercial loan, and bought 3 acres of undeveloped land on the edge of town. Using my background in construction and Eleanor's relentless administrative brilliance, we designed and built the first Silver Pines senior living facility. We didn't build a hospital. We built a community. But beautiful architecture wasn't enough to prevent the tragedy I had witnessed with my mother. The real rot in elder care didn't always come from the staff. It frequently came from the families. I had seen too many adult children dump perfectly capable parents into facilities just to liquidate their houses, seize their bank accounts, or simply avoid the inconvenience of caring for them. So, I wrote the Silver Pines Charter. It was a strict, uncompromising set of legal and ethical policies designed to protect the residents from the very people dropping them off. Our policies were legendary in the industry. We refused to accept any resident who possessed mental capacity unless they gave explicit, direct, uncoerced consent. We mandated private intake interviews, completely isolated from family members, to screen for elder abuse. We required extensive background checks on anyone claiming power of attorney, and we trained our compliance officers to look for the classic signs of financial exploitation, like a sudden rush to sell a primary residence. Silver Pines was not built to make old people disappear. It was built so families could never pretend disappearance was care. Over the next decade, the single facility grew into a highly successful regional network. We became the gold standard for senior living. But when Eleanor was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer 7 years ago, I lost my desire to run the empire we had built together. Before she died, we restructured our assets. I stepped down as the active CEO and placed my ownership of the company into the Eleanor Bennett Care Trust. I retained the title of chairman of the board, but I became a silent partner, deliberately fading from the public eye. I spent my days tending to my garden, reading in my study, and living quietly in the house I had shared with the love of my life. Most of the new staff at Silver Pines had never even seen my face. To them, the chairman was just a signature on corporate memos and holiday bonuses. Eric had never understood the business. During the years we were building the company, he was away at college, and later, busy failing at a string of ill-conceived startup ventures. He knew I had invested in real estate and that I had money, but he had never bothered to ask for the details. He was too consumed by his own ambition, always chasing the next quick payout. When he married Natalie, that ambition morphed into a toxic, impatient greed. As I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors of Silver Pines, gripping the photograph of the woman who had inspired its creation, I realized just how deeply that greed had corrupted my son. I wasn't just a father being abandoned. I was the founder of a fortress, and my son had just tried to lock me inside my own dungeon. The plan to remove me from my own life hadn't been hatched overnight. It had been meticulously cultivated over 6 months of escalating financial desperation and quiet, lethal greed. To understand how my son ended up idling his car outside a nursing home, you had to understand what he owed. Eric had always lived slightly beyond his means, fueled by Natalie's insatiable demand for a lifestyle that projected wealth they did not actually possess. 6 months ago, Eric's third startup venture had quietly collapsed, leaving him drowning in debt and facing the very real possibility of losing their upscale suburban home. I had already bailed him out twice before, draining significant portions of my liquid savings. When he came to me a third time, asking for an enormous loan to cover his immediate liabilities, I had said no. I told him I was a retired man living on a fixed income, which was technically true if you didn't count the massive, invisible fortress of the Eleanor Bennett Care Trust that I intentionally kept hidden. But even if I hadn't been hiding my wealth, I would have refused. I was done financing my son's refusal to grow up. That was when Natalie shifted her focus from my wallet to my house. The house Eleanor and I had built was fully paid off. It sat on 2 acres of prime real estate in a highly coveted neighborhood. In Natalie's eyes, it wasn't a home. It was an unliquidated asset. I had caught the first true glimpse of her plan 3 weeks before my birthday. I had been sitting in my study, the door slightly ajar, when Eric and Natalie returned from running errands. They were standing in the kitchen, their voices low but sharp, arguing about an impending mortgage payment. "I don't know what to tell you, Nat," Eric had said, sounding exhausted. "The bank won't extend the grace period. I can try asking Dad again, but he was pretty clear last time. I heard the sharp, impatient click of Natalie setting her coffee mug on the granite counter. "Asking him for a handout isn't going to fix this, Eric," she snapped. "We need actual capital. We need equity. We are drowning, and he's rattling around in a 5-bedroom house that he can barely keep clean. It's his house, Natalie. He's not going to just sell it." "Then we make the decision for him," she replied, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly rational register. "He's 72. He forgets things. He left the stove on for 10 minutes last week. He's becoming a liability to himself." "He didn't leave it on," Eric muttered defensively. "He was boiling water for pasta and the doorbell rang." "It doesn't matter," Natalie interrupted. "What matters is that we are waiting for a future while your father is sitting on it." I sat frozen in my study, the blood running cold in my veins. "We are waiting for a future while your father is sitting on it." It was the most brutal, naked admission of greed I had ever heard. She wasn't just tired of my presence. She resented my continued existence. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched as Natalie systematically built a false narrative of my decline. She started dropping hints to the neighbors. When Mrs. Gable from next door asked how I was doing, Natalie would sigh dramatically and say, "Oh, you know, he's struggling. We're having to manage a lot of his daily tasks now. It's getting dangerous for him to be alone." Then came the medical ambush. She scheduled an appointment for me with Dr. Samuel Reed, my primary care physician for the last 15 years. Natalie insisted on accompanying me into the exam room, citing family concerns. As soon as Dr. Reed walked in, Natalie launched into a rehearsed monologue. She claimed I was wandering at night, forgetting my medication, and exhibiting signs of severe cognitive decline. She asked Dr. Reed to write a formal letter declaring me mentally incapacitated so Eric could enact emergency power of attorney. Dr. Reed, a sharp, no-nonsense physician, listened quietly. Then, he turned to me and conducted a thorough 30-minute cognitive assessment. When he finished, he closed my chart and looked directly at Natalie. "Mr. Bennett is elderly," Dr. Reed said. His voice clipped and professional. "That is not the same thing as incompetent. His cognitive function is perfectly baseline for his age. I will not sign a capacity concern letter, Mrs. Bennett. And I strongly suggest you don't attempt to force a transition he doesn't need." Natalie had smiled tightly and thanked him. But a rejection from a legitimate doctor wasn't going to stop her. If she couldn't get a legal medical declaration, she would manufacture one. I later discovered she had scoured the internet until she found a questionable online medical service that issued vague behavioral observation notes based entirely on family testimony. She didn't need a formal diagnosis to drop me at a nursing home. She just needed enough paperwork to confuse the intake staff long enough to leave me in the lobby and drive away. She began assembling the admission packet. I noticed small things first. A missing bank statement. My social security card had been moved from my locked drawer. Then, I found the draft of a financial authorization form on the printer in the home office. Eric's name was printed on the line for responsible party. But the most damning piece of evidence was the home transition checklist she had left carelessly tucked inside a real estate brochure on the kitchen island. It wasn't a plan for my care. It was a strategy for my erasure. The list was written in her meticulous handwriting. 1. Book long-term placement at Silver Pines. 2. Schedule appraiser for Wednesday afternoon while Walter is at placement. 3. Contact estate liquidators for antique furniture. 4. Forward all Walter's mail to our address 5. Change exterior locks on the house. She was going to drop me off on my birthday. Change the locks on my house before the cake was even cut, and start liquidating my life the very next morning. Once Dad is settled, she had texted Eric in a message I saw flash across his iPad screen. The house is finally ours to work with. Eric, to his meager credit, had shown a brief, pathetic flicker of hesitation 2 days before the birthday trip. "Maybe we should talk to him again, Nat," Eric had whispered in the hallway. unaware I was standing just out of sight. Maybe we can convince him to downsize voluntarily. This feels extreme. We have talked, Natalie hissed back. He heard us. He just refuses to obey reality. He is hoarding an asset we desperately need, Eric. If you want to lose our house because you're too weak to manage your father, that's on you. Eric fell silent. He chose his wife's approval over his father's dignity, taking the path of least resistance right into moral bankruptcy. And why do we have to do it on his birthday? Eric had asked weakly. Because, Natalie replied, her voice devoid of any warmth. If we make it emotional, he will not fight in public. He's too proud to make a scene on his birthday. We drop him off, we hand over the paperwork, and we leave before he processes what's happening. It was a brilliant, sociopathic strategy. Use my pride as a weapon against me. Trap me in the lobby of a nursing home, surround me with strangers, and bank on the fact that I wouldn't want to cause a humiliating spectacle. She thought she had thought of everything. She had the fake medical notes. She had the forged admission packet. She had the aggressive real estate plan. But as I walked through the sliding glass doors of Silver Pines, gripping the photograph of my late wife, I knew Natalie had made a fatal miscalculation. She was trying to play chess on a board that I owned. The lobby of Silver Pines was warm, smelling faintly of vanilla and fresh linens, a specific sensory detail Eleanor had insisted upon 15 years ago. The lighting was soft, designed to reduce anxiety. It was exactly as I had built it. I stopped in the center of the lobby. Behind me, the automatic doors slid open again. Natalie marched in, holding the manila folder like a shield, with Eric trailing behind her like an obedient dog. It was time to see if the fortress I had built for others was strong enough to protect me. The lobby of Silver Pine Senior Living was a masterclass in psychological design. When Eleanor and I built it, we specifically chose warm, ambient lighting, thick acoustic carpeting, and a color palette of soft sage greens and warm ochres. It was meant to feel like a high-end boutique hotel, not a medical facility. We wanted to strip away the clinical dread that usually accompanied the transition into elder care. But as I stood near the indoor stone fireplace, watching my daughter-in-law march toward the reception desk, the warmth of the room felt sickening. Natalie slapped the thick manila folder onto the polished mahogany counter. "Good evening," Natalie said, projecting the crisp, authoritative voice of a woman who was accustomed to speaking to managers. "We have a long-term admission for Walter Bennett. We're expected." The receptionist, a young woman whose name tag read Sarah, looked up from her computer monitor. She was a newer employee. I didn't recognize her face, but she possessed the exact kind of gentle, attentive demeanor that Silver Pines actively recruited. Sarah looked at the folder, then looked past Natalie, making direct eye contact with me. "Hello, Mr. Bennett," Sarah said warmly. "Welcome to Silver Pines." She paused, adhering strictly to the intake protocol I had drafted 15 years ago. "Sir, are you here voluntarily today?" It was a simple question. It was the absolute bedrock of our admission policy. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Natalie stepped sideways, physically blocking Sarah's view of me. "Oh, he gets very confused when asked direct questions," Natalie said, lowering her voice in a grotesque pantomime of sympathy. "It overwhelms him. We've handled all the necessary consent forms in the packet." Sarah frowned slightly, her training clearly conflicting with Natalie's aggressive confidence. "I understand, ma'am, but facility policy requires verbal confirmation from the resident if they are awake and alert." "He's alert, but he's not entirely present," Eric chimed in, shuffling his feet nervously behind his wife. "He hates admitting it, but he can't live alone anymore. He needs structure." I stood by the fireplace, my hands resting on the handle of my cane. I didn't speak. I didn't correct them. I just watched them carefully, methodically lay the bricks of their own prison. Every lie they told was another piece of evidence. Every fraudulent claim was a deeper violation of the Eleanor Bennett Care Trust's anti-coercion clause. "We packed everything he needs," Natalie added, smiling at the receptionist. Honestly, this transition is a relief. I turned my head and looked directly at my son. A relief for whom? I asked quietly. Eric swallowed hard. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, anywhere but at me. He couldn't answer. Sarah picked up the manila folder and opened it. She scanned the first few pages, her frown deepening. The paperwork was a mess. It had to be. Natalie couldn't produce legitimate medical documents, so she had stuffed the folder with vague online behavioral assessments, a draft of a power of attorney that hadn't even been notarized, and a forged financial authorization. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, tapping her pen against the desk. "But this capacity concern note isn't signed by a primary care physician. And the emergency contact transfer, is there a problem?" The voice came from the hallway behind the reception desk. It was sharp, professional, and commanded absolute authority. Grace Hollis walked into the lobby. Grace was the facility director of Silver Pines. I had personally hired her 5 years ago. She was a brilliant, fiercely protective administrator who had spent her entire career fighting against the exact kind of elder exploitation currently standing at her reception desk. "I need a director's override on an intake," Sarah said, looking relieved. "The family is requesting an immediate long-term admission, but the capacity documentation is incomplete, and the resident hasn't provided verbal consent." Grace walked up to the counter. She picked up the manila folder and began flipping through the pages. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. Grace had a photographic memory for faces, and she knew exactly who I was. But she was a professional, and she played the scene perfectly. "This paperwork is insufficient for a non-voluntary admission," Grace said, closing the folder and looking at Natalie. "We cannot process an intake without direct consent unless you possess a court-ordered guardianship." "We are his family," Natalie said, her voice rising in irritation. "We are his sole caregivers. He is not safe at home. If you turn him away, you are putting a vulnerable senior at risk. I thought this facility prided itself on care." "We pride ourselves on ethical care," Grace corrected her smoothly. "Which is why I will need to conduct a private intake interview with Mr. Bennett before we proceed any further." "Absolutely not," Natalie snapped. "He gets agitated when we aren't in the room. He'll say things that don't make sense. You can't interrogate him alone." Grace clasped her hands in front of her. "Ma'am, a private interview is our non-negotiable policy for all admissions where capacity is contested by the family." "We are his family," Natalie repeated, practically vibrating with rage. "That is exactly why it is our policy," Grace replied. Her tone was polite, but the words hit like a physical blow. Eric put a hand on Natalie's arm. "Just let them talk to him, Nat," he whispered. "He's not going to pass a cognitive test. Let her see for herself." Natalie glared at Grace, but she stepped back. "Fine, 5 minutes, but we aren't leaving this lobby." Grace stepped out from behind the reception desk and walked toward me. She gestured toward a set of heavy mahogany doors down the hall. "Mr. Bennett, if you would follow me, please." I nodded, gripping my cane, and followed her down the quiet, carpeted hallway. Grace opened the door to the director's office, ushered me inside, and firmly closed the door behind us. The heavy wood muffled the sounds of the lobby, plunging the room into immediate, secure silence. Grace locked the door. Then she turned around, dropped her neutral, administrative facade, and let out a long, heavy sigh. She walked over to her desk, not to sit behind it, but to lean against the front of it, crossing her arms. She looked at me and bowed her head slightly. "Mr. Chairman," Grace said softly. "Grace," I replied, lowering myself into one of the leather guest chairs. "It's good to see you, though I wish the circumstances were better. I saw your name on the intake log 20 minutes ago and thought it had to be a clerical error," Grace said, shaking her head. "Then I saw your son's wife trying to bulldoze my receptionist with a forged financial authorization." "She's in a hurry," I noted dryly. "She has an appraiser coming to my house tomorrow afternoon to prepare for an estate liquidation." Grace's eyes narrowed. The protective instinct I had hired her for flared instantly. That explains the sloppy paperwork, Grace said. They're trying to dump you to clear the property title. Do you want me to call board counsel right now? Evelyn Shaw is still at the corporate office. She can have a cease and desist drafted in 10 minutes. I looked at the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor, which I had placed gently on the edge of Grace's desk. Not yet, I said quietly. Grace raised an eyebrow. You want to let them keep digging? I want them to sign the final financial liability forms, I said, looking up at her. I want them to formally submit that fraudulent capacity note into your permanent medical record system. Right now, they're just arguing in a lobby. Once they sign those final intake documents, they have committed undeniable, documented elder coercion. I want the trap fully sprung before we close it. Grace nodded slowly, a small, dangerous smile touching the corners of her mouth. Understood. I'll go back out there. I'll tell them you're confused but compliant. I'll have Linda from compliance bring out the final signature packet. Thank you, Grace. She unlocked the office door and stepped back out into the hallway. I remained in the chair, listening to the muffled sounds of the facility I had built. 5 minutes later, I walked back out to the lobby. Natalie was hunched over the reception desk, furiously signing her name and Eric's name on a stack of legally binding intake documents. Eric was standing by the suitcases, looking miserable, checking his watch. Can we speed this up? Natalie asked, thrusting the clipboard back at Linda, the facility's senior compliance officer. We have birthday dinner reservations in 45 minutes, and we really need to get going. Linda took the clipboard, reviewing the signatures with a clinical eye. She looked at Grace and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The documents were signed. The fraud was formalized. Grace stepped forward, standing between Natalie and the reception desk. She didn't look at Natalie. She didn't look at Eric. She looked directly at me. And then, in a clear, carrying voice that echoed across the quiet lobby, Grace asked the question that ended my son's future. Mr. Chairman, Grace said, standing perfectly straight. Would you like this handled privately or formally? The silence that fell over the lobby was absolute. It was the kind of silence that follows a lightning strike just before the thunder hits. Eric frowned, looking from Grace to me. What did she call you? Eric asked, his voice wavering. I stepped forward, leaning my weight on my cane. I looked at the 2 suitcases on the curb. I looked at the fraudulent admission folder on the desk. Then I looked at my son. The title your wife should have checked, I said. Before she packed my suitcase, 10 minutes later, we were no longer standing in the warm, ambient glow of the lobby. We were sitting in the primary executive conference room of Silver Pines. The aesthetic warmth of the facility did not extend into this room. The walls were lined with stark acoustic paneling, the lighting was bright and clinical, and the long conference table was made of heavy, imposing slate. This room was designed for one purpose: corporate accountability. I sat at the head of the table. Grace Hollis sat to my right. Linda, the senior compliance officer, sat next to her, arranging the documents from Natalie's Manila folder into neat, damning stacks. Eric and Natalie sat on the opposite side of the table. Eric looked like he was vibrating with panic. He kept looking around the room, taking in the framed corporate charters and the Silver Pines organizational chart on the wall, struggling to reconcile the old man he had just tried to abandon with the reality of the empire he was sitting inside. Natalie, however, was clinging to her arrogance like a life preserver. This is absurd, Natalie said, crossing her arms and glaring at Grace. I don't care what ceremonial title you've given him. We are his family. We have medical concerns about his capacity to live independently. You cannot simply override our authority because he used to work here. He didn't just work here, Mrs. Bennett. The voice came from the doorway. Evelyn Shaw, the senior trust counsel for the Eleanor Bennett Care Trust, walked into the conference room. She was wearing a sharp, tailored suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. and projecting the kind of ruthless legal authority that made opposing attorneys sweat. Evelyn walked to the table and took the seat to my left. Walter Bennett didn't just work here, Evelyn repeated, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick, bound legal document. He built this facility. He built the entire Silver Pines network. He is the sole chairman of the board, the primary trustee of the holding company. And he owns the very chair you are currently sitting in. Eric physically recoiled, sinking back into his seat as if he had been struck. You own this place? He stammered, looking at me. All of it? I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. Evelyn turned her attention to Natalie. Now, Mrs. Bennett, let's discuss your authority. Linda, if you would. Linda, the compliance officer, picked up the first stack of papers from the admission packet. Facility policy, mandated by the chairman himself 15 years ago, requires direct, uncoerced verbal and written consent from any resident entering long-term placement, Linda stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Mr. Bennett did not provide verbal consent. Furthermore, the signature line on the primary admission agreement is blank. He has cognitive decline, Natalie argued, her voice shrill. He doesn't understand what he's signing. We have medical documentation. You have a behavioral observation note from an online physician who has never met Mr. Bennett in person, Linda corrected her smoothly. We ran the physician's license number. It's currently under review by the state medical board for issuing fraudulent prescriptions. Natalie's face flushed a deep, angry red. That doesn't prove anything. We asked his primary care physician. You asked Dr. Samuel Reed to declare him incompetent, Evelyn interrupted, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Reed refused. I know this because Dr. Reed is also the consulting geriatric specialist for the Silver Pines network. He called me the moment you left his office last week to flag a potential case of elder coercion. Eric whipped his head around to stare at his wife. You went to Dr. Reed? He whispered. You told me Dad just missed his appointment. Natalie ignored him, leaning forward, her hands flat on the slate table. We were trying to help him, she insisted, though the desperation in her voice was finally beginning to crack through her confident veneer. He is a danger to himself. He left the stove on. He was boiling water for pasta, Evelyn said dryly. Which is irrelevant, because you weren't trying to secure care for your father-in-law, Mrs. Bennett. You were trying to secure his equity. Evelyn slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a photocopy of the home transition checklist I had found in my study. You booked a long-term placement for today, his birthday, knowing it would minimize his likelihood of causing a scene, Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. You scheduled a real estate appraiser for tomorrow afternoon. You contacted an estate liquidator to empty his house, and you drafted an emergency power of attorney, which you intended to execute the moment he was trapped in this facility. That was just contingency planning, Natalie stammered, shrinking back from the table. We needed a plan in case he declined further. This is a complete misunderstanding. Linda, the compliance officer, didn't argue. She simply picked up the manila folder Natalie had decorated with a birthday ribbon. She removed the ribbon, pulled out a heavy rubber stamp, and pressed it hard against the cover. When she lifted the stamp, the words were emblazoned in stark red ink. Asterisk Regit, suspected elder coercion. As a mandated reporting facility, Grace added, her voice echoing in the silent room, Silver Pines is now required by law to submit this entire packet, including your handwritten checklist to change the exterior locks to Adult Protective Services. It wasn't a contingency, I said, speaking for the first time since we entered the room. The silence that followed was absolute. Eric and Natalie both stared at me. You were waiting for a future, I said, looking directly into Natalie's eyes, quoting her own words back to her, and I was sitting on it. Natalie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The realization that I had heard her, that I had known exactly what she was doing the entire time, finally broke her. She slumped back in her chair, staring at the slate table. I turned my gaze to my son. Eric was weeping silently. Tears were streaming down his face, dropping onto the collar of his expensive unpaid-for shirt. "Dad, I'm so sorry." Eric choked out, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't know it would go this far. I thought we were just getting you some help. I didn't know she was selling the house." I looked at the man I had raised. A man who had allowed his greed and his cowardice to completely override his morality. "You packed my wife's photograph, Eric," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy, jagged, and infinitely sad in my throat. "How much farther did you think leaving went?" Eric sobbed, unable to answer. He knew the truth. He had packed that photograph knowing he was never going to see me in that house again. Evelyn cleared her throat, bringing the room back to the cold, hard reality of the law. "Based on the fraudulent nature of this admission packet, Silver Pines formally refuses intake for Walter Bennett," Evelyn announced. "Furthermore, as the facility's compliance officer, Linda has already initiated a formal report for suspected elder coercion with the state authorities." Natalie's head snapped up. "You can't do that. We haven't done anything illegal." "You attempted to fraudulently execute a financial transition by isolating a vulnerable adult under the guise of medical necessity," Evelyn corrected her. "That is the definition of elder coercion, but that is for the state to decide. My concern is the trust." Evelyn opened the bound legal document she had pulled from her briefcase. "Effective immediately. Eric Bennett is removed as the secondary successor to the Eleanor Bennett Care Trust," Evelyn stated. "You will receive no equity from the house, no liquid assets from the accounts, and no shares in the Silver Pines network." Eric didn't argue. He just kept his face buried in his hands. Finally, Evelyn looked at Natalie with a gaze so cold it could have frozen water. "Mrs. Bennett, you are hereby permanently banned from the private property of Walter Bennett and from the premises of any Silver Pines facility. If you attempt to contact Mr. Bennett, transfer his mail, or initiate any further real estate inquiries regarding his home, I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted to the absolute maximum extent of the law." Evelyn closed the bound document with a sharp, echoing snap. "Do you understand?" Evelyn asked. Natalie didn't speak. She just nodded, her face pale, her arrogant facade completely shattered. Grace stood up from the table. "The exit is down the hall to your left," she said, gesturing toward the door. Eric stood up slowly. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash, only to realize he had caused it. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a reprieve, for a sliver of the fatherly grace I had always extended to him in the past. "Dad," Eric whispered, "please." I looked at him, feeling the familiar, heavy ache of parental love warring with the absolute necessity of boundaries. "You brought me here to leave me behind," I said quietly. I stood up, gripping my cane, and looked at the framed charter on the wall. The charter Eleanor and I had written together. "I built this place so people like you could never do that legally," I told him. "Now take your suitcases and go." Eric nodded, the last bit of hope draining from his eyes. He turned and followed his wife out of the conference room, leaving behind the father he had tried to discard, and the empire he had never known existed. Natalie had walked into Silver Pines expecting to manipulate a receptionist. Instead, she found a compliance system designed by the man she was trying to erase. By the time we left the conference room, half the senior staff knew Natalie Bennett as the woman who tried to abandon the chairman in his own lobby. The drive back to my house that evening was quiet, but it wasn't lonely. Grace had insisted that the Silver Pines corporate driver take me home, refusing to let me call a taxi. I sat in the spacious backseat of the black sedan, watching the streetlights blur against the frosted windows, feeling the heavy metallic exhaustion of a battle fought and won. When the car pulled into my driveway, the house was dark. I unlocked the front door, walked inside, and turned on the foyer light. The house was exactly as I had left it. Natalie hadn't had the time to initiate her home transition checklist. The very next morning, Evelyn Shaw went to work with the ruthless efficiency that made her the most feared trust attorney in the county. By 9 a.m., Evelyn had legally dissolved the emergency power of attorney draft before Natalie could even attempt to file it. By 10 a.m., the appointment with the real estate appraiser was formally cancelled. By noon, Evelyn had contacted the postal service, freezing any attempt to forward my mail to Eric's address. And at 2 p.m., I hired a locksmith. I stood on the front porch in the afternoon sun and watched the technician remove the brass deadbolt I had installed 20 years ago. When he handed me the new keys, I felt a profound sense of finality. Natalie had wanted to change the locks on this house while I was trapped in a nursing home. Instead, the locks were changed while she was effectively rendered homeless by her own greed. By Monday morning, the attempted placement had become a mandatory report case. Adult Protective Services officially opened an investigation into Natalie. Evelyn filed a formal complaint against the online physician who issued the fraudulent capacity note, triggering an immediate suspension of their medical license. The estate liquidator and the real estate appraiser both received aggressive cease and desist letters, completely severing their ties with Eric and Natalie. Natalie had not just failed to abandon me. She had created a permanent compliance file with her own signature on every page. Furthermore, her name was now explicitly used in internal Silver Pines training sessions as a textbook case study on attempted coercive placement. Without the equity from my house to save them, Eric and Natalie's financial reality collapsed immediately. I didn't reach out to them, and they didn't dare reach out to me. Through Evelyn, I learned that they were forced to list their suburban home for a massive loss to avoid imminent foreclosure. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. The extravagant lifestyle Natalie had prized above my dignity was gone forever. A week after my birthday, I was sitting in my study, drinking tea and reading a biography of Theodore Roosevelt when the doorbell rang. I didn't rush. I walked slowly through the hallway, my cane tapping against the hardwood floor. I checked the security camera monitor on the wall. It was Eric. He was alone. He was wearing a faded jacket. His shoulders hunched against the winter wind, looking older and more exhausted than I had ever seen him. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. I didn't invite him inside. I stood in the doorway, the warm air from the house washing over him. "Dad," Eric said softly, his breath pluming in the cold air. I looked at him. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a deep, hollow sadness. "What do you want, Eric?" "I came to apologize," he said, looking down at the welcome mat. I've been thinking about what happened every single day. I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror. I let Natalie convince me that it was the only way out of the debt. I let her convince me that you wouldn't mind. I remained silent, letting his excuses wither in the cold air between us. "I thought I was doing what adults do," Eric pleaded, finally looking up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. "I thought making the hard decision for you was part of being the man of the family." I gripped the handle of my cane. "No, Eric," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "Adults have hard conversations. Adults face their financial failures. Adults look their fathers in the eye and ask for help." Eric swallowed hard, tears welling in his eyes. "Cowards pack suitcases," I finished quietly. I know," he whispered, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "I know I was a coward. I just want to know if there's any way back from this, if you can ever forgive me." I looked at the son I had raised, the son I had bailed out time and time again, the son who had been willing to warehouse me to save his own pride. "You did not make a hard decision, Eric," I said, the absolute truth ringing in the cold air. "You made a convenient one and called it care. Forgiveness isn't a gift you demand just because you feel guilty. It's a house you have to build from the ground up, brick by painful brick. Right now, you don't even have a foundation." Eric bowed his head, accepting the weight of his own failure. "If you want a way back," I told him, "start with the truth. Write down everything Natalie asked you to sign. Give it to Evelyn. Call the appraiser yourself and tell him your father was never selling the house. Then spend 1 year paying your own debts without using my age as collateral. Only then can you ask to sit at my table again. I stepped back and began to close the door. Take care of yourself, Eric. I closed the heavy wooden door, the new deadbolt clicking into place with a sharp, echoing snap. It was the hardest thing I had ever done in my life, but it was the only way he would ever learn. 2 days later, I didn't stay home. I put on my best wool suit, tucked Eleanor's silver-framed photograph under my arm, and drove myself back to Silver Pine Senior Living. I didn't walk in as a confused intake. I walked through the sliding glass doors as the chairman of the board. Grace Hollis was waiting for me in the lobby. She smiled warmly and escorted me into the main dining room. The room was beautifully decorated with silver balloons and a large banner that read, "Happy belated birthday, Mr. Chairman." I spent the evening sitting at a large round table with Grace, Linda, Dr. Reed, and half a dozen residents who had become my friends over the years. We ate steak. We drank good wine. We cut a massive 3-tiered chocolate cake. For the first time since Eleanor died, I felt completely at peace with the legacy we had created. Later that evening, after the party had wound down, I sat alone in Grace's office. The facility was quiet, settling into the comfortable, secure rhythm of the night shift. I placed Eleanor's photograph on the desk in front of me. I looked at her smiling face, remembering the day she had put her hand on my shoulder in that sterile, awful hallway after my mother died. "You were right," I whispered to the photograph. "We built the place she deserved." When I returned home that night, the house was perfectly silent. I walked into my bedroom and placed Eleanor's photograph back on the nightstand, exactly where it belonged. Then, I walked back out into the foyer. I had brought something home from Grace's office. It was a small, elegantly framed piece of heavy cardstock. I took a hammer and a single brass nail, and I hung the frame on the wall right next to the front door, where anyone entering or leaving the house would have to see it. It wasn't a list of arbitrary restrictions. It was a declaration of the philosophy that had saved my life. Asterisk the Bennett rule. No one is placed where they did not choose to go. No parent is made homeless for a child's convenience. No family gets to call abandonment care. I stepped back and looked at the frame. It was perfect. My son had taken me to Silver Pines to end my place in his life. He thought he was closing the book on an old man who had outlived his usefulness. Instead, he discovered I had built Silver Pines to protect people from sons exactly like him. And on my 72nd birthday, I did not lose my home. I remembered why I had built one for everyone else. If you were Walter, would you give Eric a chance to rebuild the relationship after he hit rock bottom? Or did the moment he put his father's suitcases on the curb prove that some betrayals can never be forgiven? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories.